Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for joining this session of the Institute for National Strategic Studies web seminars done in collaboration with the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team. I'm Michael McCloushik, Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies and the editor of PRISM, and I'm extremely happy to welcome back the Honorable Ms. Federica Mogherini, who was so rudely cut off last week by a Microsoft server failure, but not before delivering a magisterial overview of Europe's role in today's great power competition. Her remarks, unsurprisingly, generated quite a few questions we weren't able to get to, so Mrs. Mogherini has graciously agreed to address as many of those questions with us today as we have time for. But we only have 1 hour, so I will dispense with any further remarks other than to thank my colleagues at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team, as always, for their teamwork and their support. Director Mogherini, if you're ready, I'd like to just jump right in with the first question, which is actually from my colleague on the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team, Todd Veazey, who noted that Freedom House has documented a trend of freedom in decline for many years now. The recent rise in populism, nationalism, and nativism is a related concern. Will you comment on these dynamics and how Europe and the United States might develop a shared approach to confronting this?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me again, and it's great to see you and continue our conversation. It was so frustrating to interrupt it so brutally last week, so I'm really happy we have an opportunity to continue this exchange and address some of the questions. So thank you for that. The question is definitely a difficult one. I wish I had the answer to that. I'm afraid that none of us has the silver bullet to solve such an issue in one go. But indeed, what I see clearly is a trend not only in some parts of the world, but I think all over the world. Trend of a shrinking space for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. In some cases, taking some dramatic forms. In some other cases, in the form, let's say, of what a democratic system still allows, but with some peaks of, I would say, irritual or even more than irritual, warring features, including in our own countries. I think that in the United States and in Europe and in some of the liberal democracies around the world, we also see trends of movements, extreme right movements. Well, we've seen some of this taking place, sadly, on Capitol Hill in the beginning of January. And I think that in general terms, we have, yes, indeed, across the world, somehow a global movement of ideas that oppose a certain way of thinking and living. How to react to that? Well, the only answer I have, and again, I wish I had a better answer to that, the only answer I have is to try to call things with their names, analyze dynamics for what they are without shying away from them. I think sometimes we have in the West the attitude of looking at us at ourselves as the best examples of democracies and rule of law and human rights, which is actually true. But this sometimes doesn't let us focus on the shortcomings we have internally. I believe personally that the first reaction to this trend is that of leading by example. I think President Biden referred to that in his inauguration speech, and trying to be true to our values internally as much as we can, to be consistent. And this might require a certain element of self-criticism and even sometimes some tough measures. Inside the European Union, we've had tough debates in these last years about full respect of rule of law standards that, as you know, in the European Union are particularly high. For what concerns some of the member states' legislation or attitude towards, for instance, the judiciary or independent journalism. And I think it is very healthy to have that public debate openly and trying to address, even from a legal framework point of view, which is something in the European Union we have, to try and address these shortcomings in a consistent manner. It's not an easy exercise, I think, especially because you look around yourself and you see that in other countries the standards are much lower, so you tend to think that you're in a good place anyway. But I think that the only reaction we can have is to clearly assess what we can do better and how, and try to improve on a daily basis on our democratic standards at home, even if we have the impression that we are close to perfect. I think we are not, and I think that addressing these shortcomings at home make us more credible and more consistent in then trying to advocate them abroad.
I hope you'll agree that the sign of a good question is that it generates not easy answers, but serious thought. A related question is from our mutual friend, Lawrence Larry Chalmer, who begins by thanking you for supporting College of Europe students in the 36th International Model NATO, held last month in Washington. Your team represented Portugal. He notes that you've known both the presence and the absence of political will among governments in your previous duties. Will you describe the political will that you see in today's youth within both NATO and EU countries? Are they ready to support national governments and their security interests, or to overthrow them?
All easy questions. Well, first of all, thanks to our common friends for the question, but also for the work we do with the NATO model. Indeed, our students were very excited and very happy of their experience there, and indeed they represented Portugal. And for a few days, I could only see in the Twitter accounts of all the students in the college Portuguese flags and symbols, and they were really identifying very strongly with that mission. So it was great to see their enthusiasm. I think that we have here the effect of a double crisis we've faced. First, the financial crisis, 2008, that has had a very strong impact on our national budgets. At the same time, or almost at the same time, as the NATO allies had committed to raise their GDP percentage of military investments to 2%. So the combination of these two factors has created, I think, some question marks in public opinions, at least in Europe, where the financial crisis has hit significantly our economic situation. And then I think the sanitary crisis, the pandemic currently, I think is creating a lot of support for reorienting public spending towards research, health systems, especially public health systems, which, as you know, in Europe are particularly solid and strong. And also in some strategic investments in terms of supply chain of basic sanitary equipment or medical treatments or vaccines. So I think, and also the related concerns about investments in consistent investments in climate change action. Because I think the younger generations see clearly the link between the pandemic we are living and the overall context of a deteriorating environmental framework across the world. So I see the younger generation saying, and convincingly so probably, now today we have to face this pandemic. This is probably not going to be the last one. So we better prepare for handling this kind of crisis in a cyclical manner. And that might require a shift of paradigm in the way in which we invest our public resources. And that is connected to something probably even bigger to come in terms of climate change disruption. And so how do we plan ahead so that we are able to face this kind of trends and situations in the future? This to say that I think that the combination of the financial crisis in 2008 and its social economic impact on our societies across the Atlantic plus the need to, or the feeling of urgency about reorienting public spending more towards health-related and climate-related measures, might endanger the support, the public opinion support, and in particular the younger generations support towards investments in the sector of defense. Having said that, and as I would continue the being blunt attitude I inaugurated last week, for sure, this last 4 years of US administration has not helped in building a strong sense of trust in the transatlantic alliance, because many Europeans in these last 4 years might have thought, well, if in Washington there's no desire to invest in the transatlantic alliance, why should we? And this might have had an impact, especially in the younger generations that do not have the memories of why the alliance had started in the very first place. Don't have an experience of war, don't have an experience of post-war, don't have an experience of Cold War, nor of deterrence. So they might have more difficulties in focusing or identifying on the reasons why the alliance is vital. Having said that, which is not encouraging, I believe strongly that the alliance is the backbone of our friendship and our cooperation. I personally believe that in between these two crises, the financial one and the sanitary one, we had another huge crisis that was the threats to our security on our own soil, with the terrorist attacks in Europe and obviously 9/11 in the United States. And at that moment, there was a very strong sense of urgency from the public opinions on the need to invest in defense and security measures. Now, that window of opportunity seems now to be closing because, as I said, of the focus on more sanitary or climate-related needs. But I believe that deep in the back of the mind of also the younger generations, there is the awareness of this need to invest in security and defense through the transatlantic channels. I don't question and I have no doubts that younger generations across the Atlantic would argue against investing in the transatlantic alliance in NATO. I would rather question their support to defense spending and investment. That is my point of worry. I think it would be a mistake not to do so. So I think that the more we manage to communicate the relevance of the alliance, the better it is. I think it was very smart from Stoltenberg perspective to include, for instance, climate change action among the NATO priorities, because I think that this creates exactly that connection with the current concerns of the younger generations. I think this is excellent. And then, obviously, there continues to be the external challenge and threat to our own security in Europe. I'm sure that if you ask younger generations in the Baltic countries or in Poland about the relevance of NATO, and you ask the same age group in Poland or in Ireland, you might get different answers, simply because the perception of the threat is a different one. But again, sorry, I've been I've been too long, but it's also true that, again, the sense of protection that the alliance gives to all of Europe, I think, but in particular Central and Eastern Europe, and partially in the South, even if to a lesser extent, is and continues to be extremely relevant. And you've seen it during the, I think it was the last NATO summit in Brussels, when President Trump questioned the alliance. The reaction in Europe was very strong, saying, no, we need the alliance. It's true that you had Macron saying something else, but in general terms, the European reaction was that of an attachment and an affection towards the alliance and the sense of betrayal that we had in the moment when it was questioned on the other side of the Atlantic. So I would say it's not a black and white picture, it's more nuanced. And I think that the more we manage to project an image of NATO as being relevant not only to the hard security, purely military challenges and threats, and more looking into the hybrid threats, the climate-related threats, the cyber attacks. This for sure increases the element of support that younger generations can have towards the alliance. I answered the question. I was too long.
Not at all, Rector. Sometimes short questions need long answers. But with that, I'd like to migrate to another aspect of the today's great power competition, with a question from Peter Scharfman from the MITRE Corporation. In economic matters and technological innovation, how can Europe and the United States reconcile the need for cooperation to offset China's sheer market size with competition between our companies?
I missed the last part of it because the sound disappeared. I'm sorry.
It's okay. How can Europe and the United States reconcile the need for cooperation to offset China's sheer market size with competition between our companies?
All easy questions. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this respect. It's not I have to admit, it's not my main field of competence. So on this, I'm definitely not an expert, and I cannot have insights that are better than the ones of others following this debate. But what I've seen is that in these years we have missed probably an opportunity. To tell you the truth, I felt that not advancing and then not concluding and then dropping completely the idea of a transatlantic trade agreement among us is a waste, a loss, probably a mistake. I know it's not on the agenda anymore, but at a certain moment I thought that was probably the way to strengthen the links and create spaces for more economic cooperation and synergies among us. Then we probably have to look at how we address some of the common challenges, for sure, vis-a-vis China. Here I don't see too much of, well, I guess that a lot of that can be done among different corporate businesses if they manage to come together. Always difficult to say whether the element of competition, which is the backbone of economic activities, manages to overcome this elements of fragmentation and to put together some elements of synergies and connection. I don't know how this could be developed with institutional instruments at this stage. I don't clearly see how any public intervention, any institutional intervention, any legislation or framework of agreements could actually support or incentivize this kind of approach. And I personally don't have enough insights in the business community to say if there are trends on the private sector level that go in that direction. It would make a lot of sense, but I personally don't have the key to try and unblock that kind of potential that indeed would be necessary.
Well, let's move to a related issue then. Last week, you spoke of the need for European strategic autonomy to advance its values, including human rights and the rule of law. At the same time, we have European interests in economic interests in dealing with China and greater economic engagement. How do we reconcile that tension between Europe's values, its political values, and its economic interests?
This is a question that is valid for everybody, everywhere in the world. I've been often asked this question, especially from American friends. And, you know, there is an issue there, and you know that the European Union applies some human rights clauses to its own trade agreements and investment agreements, for instance, especially when it comes to labor rights or environmental rights. So normally the European Union has, more than any other country or entity in the world, a certain normative power introduced in its trade agreements and investments agreements. to the extent that it is often accused of distorting the economic dynamics through this element of political twist. But it is true, there's no agreement the European Union has, a trade agreement or investment agreement the European Union has with anybody in the world that doesn't contain also clauses related to human rights or environmental rights and so on and so forth. So this is the starting point. Having said that, the key basic question that lies at the end of behind this kind of question is this, and it's a very difficult question to answer. Do we trade only with democracies that respect 100% human rights in the world? Does the United States do? Does the European Union member state, does the European Union does? Do the European Union member states do? Does Canada do? Does Australia do? Does Japan do? I have the impression that this is not the case. If that was the case, we would probably have a completely different picture of trade flows in the world. And very long debates in national parliaments and congresses on who can you trade with. Well, there's a lot of discussion even about who you can trade with in terms of arms and military equipment. Imagine if you talk about, I don't know, rice or soya or oil or whatever. So here there are these two elements. How, for me, the real question is this: how do you manage to use trade as an instrument to promote a human rights-based agenda? And here again, the European approach is this: to try and include as advanced as possible clauses in the trade and investment agreements that condition some of the investment and trade agreements to the respect in that country of some measures. Obviously, it's not 100% perfect, it's very nuanced, but I think that this is the only approach you can have. Again, the option of forbidding trade with a country for the lack of respect of human rights, I don't see this as a feasible option worldwide if consistently applied. But I might be wrong.
Matthew Cohen asks if you could please discuss the areas of both common interests and divergent interests vis-a-vis European and US approaches to Russia.
I think that here we have common interests. I don't see diverging interests. Personally, I don't see diverging interests. I think that on Russia, Europe and the United States have a full coincidence of interest, potentially completely aligned approach. We have the same approach to democracy, rule of law, support to civil society and human rights activists internally. We have the same approach towards democratic movements in some of the Eastern European countries, starting from Belarus. We have the same approach in terms of support of the Ukrainian sovereignty, the same non-recognition policy of the illegal annexation of Crimea, the same kind of support to the agenda of reforms in these countries, starting from Ukraine, but also same approach towards full respect of sovereignty and international law when it comes to Georgia, for instance, or Moldova. I don't see, and the same approach, I believe now to the disinformation campaign, or even the meddling into democratic processes in third countries coming from the Russian Federation. And we have had always the same kind of approach. Also, I think when it came to, for instance, threats that the Russian coming from Russia in third countries, with even using chemical agents and weapons, like it happened recently in the UK. So, and on top of everything else, I think we have the same approach also on the main key issues or files of foreign policy and crisis, where Russia plays a role. We tend to have, between the European Union and the United States, similar approaches towards the Russian attitude in Syria or in Libya or in other crises where, again, it is playing a role. So I personally don't see divergences there. I see convergence. I see the need to coordinate policies much more. By the way, we have sanctions policies in place. They're not coordinated. They have been for a certain period of time. I think we should coordinate them more. But I only see a convergence of interests and approaches there. And by the way, I think this is a very solid element also of the transatlantic alliance.
I couldn't agree with you more. And yet, the Nord Stream 2 issue has arisen with the Biden administration, and there is a obvious disagreement between the United States and Germany on that. Is that indicative of a Russian intent to use these issues as a wedge to try to force apart members of the transatlantic alliance?
You know, the Nord Stream 2 indeed is a German issue. It's not a European issue, in the sense that the European institutions have constantly, let's say, asked for consistency and clarity and transparency. But this is a national competence of Germany, so I wouldn't see this as a European American divergence on Russia. I would see this as a German issue that needs to be somehow tackled at national level. This is you managed to get a diplomatic answer from me for once.
That's very diplomatic, but
you know, I'm Italian, and there was, and I've been a minister in Italy, and there was a South Stream project as well, and it dropped. This to tell you to what extent this is not a European issue. This is a national interests issue.
But that actually leads to a question from David Armitage, who asks how European strategic autonomy relates to member state autonomy. And as an example, he asks, will France, Germany, or Italy ever subordinate their freedom of action to Brussels?
This is more of a theoretical question than of a practical question, I have to say. It's a question that resonates a lot in the European debate. It's frequently asked. In Europe, we tend to put it in a slightly different way, which is not in terms of autonomy, but in terms of differentiation. I had yesterday a very interesting exchange with a group of researchers from the Italian and the Finnish Institute of Foreign Affairs, exactly on positive or challenging examples of differentiation in foreign and security policy among member states. Sometimes you have groups of countries that go their way, and sometimes this is useful for the European Union. Some other times it's challenging for the European Union. So in Europe, it's more seen as a challenge to the unity or the coherence of the Union, rather than a matter of autonomy. Why? Because it's very clear to us, at least it's very clear to me, but I think it's very clear to us Europeans in general terms, that being together in the Union is not giving up. It doesn't mean giving up to your own national foreign or security policy or defense policy. There's no plan, there's no treaty provision that foresees that being together, you stop having a national foreign policy or a national defense policy. So you don't need to develop autonomy there, because your national competence is clear. But it's on the other side, there might be a lack of coherence or a divergence between a national interest on one specific file and the common decisions that are discussed and taken at European level. In most of the cases, this is the difficulty of the job I used to have, trying to put together, at my time 28, now 27, different national policies, not making one of them, because you will always have a French policy in Mali and an Italian policy in Libya and a Greek policy on Turkey. That's even the beauty of being 27. Otherwise, we would merge into one country, and we would probably lose part of the diversity, which is also an asset in the relation with other countries and different regions of the world. But the challenge is exactly that of trying to use the specificity of the 27 different national policies to decide what to do together. in a productive way. And that exercise is possible and extremely useful if and when you manage to make emerge in the capitals, in the 27 member states, the elements of their own national policy and their own national interests that are better served through a common European Union action. So that actually you don't contrapose the national interest with the European interest, but you say your national priorities are better served through a common action of that kind. Obviously, you might need to give up to some elements of your strategy in the common picture. You can keep them at national level, but you gain the economy of scale, let's put it this way, of a union that has much more of an impact than any single member state. I often tell all my European friends, especially those that perceive to come from big countries, that in Europe you don't have big and small countries, you only have countries that have not yet realized they're small. So everybody has an interest, if they want to promote their national policies, to go through a different channel that is bigger than the one they have already at home. It's a thin line, but it's a possible exercise, and most of the time it works.
Rector, I'm going to now share an undiplomatic question. You spoke last week on the need for the European Union to create more stable relationships with countries to its east, such as Ukraine, to create a common policy on Russia. Can these countries, Ukraine in particular, be trusted as steady allies in this effort, given their own struggles with governmental corruption? Yes,
I think yes, but it's not a light-hearted yes. I think the question points exactly at the key elements we should address together across the Atlantic on what does it mean to really support our Eastern partners, Ukraine, but also other countries. I think of Moldova, I think of others, meaning for a certain time, for a certain period of time, and I'll be as undiplomatic as the question is, for a certain period of time, starting from 2014 onwards, the shock and the reaction to the Russian behavior was such that we were sometimes tempted to support our friends in Ukraine, whatever they were doing, because it was so hard and so unbelievable, the breach of international law that was happening on their soil, that we felt the moral duty to be behind them no matter what. And I have many times visited Ukraine, and I've sometimes been impressed by meetings I had with the civil society there, human rights activists, the same that were animating Maidan probably a couple of years before, that were telling me, don't you realize that your unconditional support is preventing, or at least is not pushing enough to create the space for deep reforms that are needed, especially on anti-corruption. Not only on anti-corruption, also on the reform of the institutional system, judiciary first of all. And I think that after a couple of years, 2016, 2017, we managed to find a way to match the clear signal of support that we had to give also in the face of the Russian aggression. Because obviously whatever you were saying to criticize the attitude of the leadership in Ukraine could have been used by the Russian messages or propaganda to dismantle the trust internally, domestically in Ukraine. But we managed at a certain moment, I think, to find a balance in Europe between a strong, consistent support. The European Union has supported Ukraine with the largest ever economic support package in its history. It means that never in the history of the European Union, long decades, the European Union has never given such a large economic support package to any third country in the world. I don't often say this in Europe because not all of our public opinions might like to hear that in the years following a financial crisis. So we managed to match this support to clear stand on the conflict and Russia, and pressure on the institutions in Ukraine for a reform agenda. It has not been easy. Not all our summits or ministerial meetings or visits with our Ukrainian friends have been easy. In some cases, there have been difficult moments on some legislation, on some lack of reforms, on some lack of transparency, on some. But the reason why I said yes, they can be trusted, is that I believe strongly that a country is not only its institutions, it's its people, first of all. And I've always believed that the Ukrainians deeply and profoundly believe and feel the need to have a different kind of country. And I would trust them. I would definitely trust them. Then there's a need, I think, to make it clear to our interlocutors in the Ukrainian institutions, but not only in Ukraine, also in other countries in the east of Europe, that they cannot politicize the support they get. They cannot use it for domestic politics, for instance. This is an issue that in Europe we have had to discuss a lot. They should not, for instance, I believe, this is true for the European Union, but also for NATO, I think the political leaderships of those countries, the leaders of these countries should never make, for instance, the cooperation and partnership with the European Union or with NATO a matter for domestic controversies. They should make it a national issue, not a party issue. And sometimes that is a shortcut they are or might be tempted to take. Saying, I am the one that is a friend of the West. And then, if you have a change in leadership, where do you start from? So to make it clear that the partnership is with a country, is not with a leader, is not with a political party, is with the country, is with the people. And it's a long process of reform, a tough reform agenda. And at the end of the day, the European Union has association agreements with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And that is, in concrete terms, a package of economic support and the conditionality of deep reforms with a timetable, with parameters, standards, benchmarking, very tough. And this is what we're doing now since 5, 6, 7 years with the three of them. And I think it works. And it's difficult to reform. It's we know it's. We've seen it also in countries that have then joined the European Union. It's difficult to reform deeply a system that has been for decades based on different principles and criteria. But Poland did it, Hungary did it, Czechoslovakia did it, in Czech and Republic and in Slovakia. The Baltic countries did it. In the Balkan countries, they are doing it, and they did it for some of them. So it's a long process, but it's a process that it's worth having. And in my experience, in what I see, what makes the difference if the process works or not is the determination of the population of the country. If they really want to change their country, maybe I might be a naive on this, but I think that if the public opinions, if the people really want reforms, they get there.
Thank you, Rector. We have a saying that we can't want it more than they want it. So
exactly,
there's some truth to that.
And we shouldn't, because at the end of the day, this is also self-determination.
That's right. Yeah, Rector, in a forthcoming article in PRISM, American Enterprise Institute scholar Elizabeth Braw points out the asymmetrical advantages that Russia exploits in what's called hybrid warfare. Is there a serious discussion in Europe on how to respond to Russia's hybrid warfare aggression?
Yes, since several years now, and I'm proud to say this is a work that we have, well, not started, because I think the work on hybrid warfare is as old as history. If you allow me to use a very good example that Stoltenberg often uses, probably the first hybrid warfare experiment was the Trojan horse. We might face different evolutions of the hybrid warfare, but the principle, the concept as such, is as old as history. But what I'm proud of is the fact that we have started a systematic work structural work on how to face hybrid warfare together with NATO. There have been two pillars, two initial points, three I would say, of our cooperation with NATO. You might know we signed with NATO, between the European Union and NATO, a partnership agreement that includes many different actions and sort of really an action plan that is now being carried out in the last years. And the main focus of that is exactly what cyber attacks, extremely important for both of us, including with exercises, top table exercises, staff-to-staff exchanges, hybrid threats, and how to counter that. And I would say also the third pillar of this cooperation is for sure exchanges and exchanges of information and of good practices around our operations and missions. But going on the hybrid threats, what I was saying is self-evident in the fact that, if I'm not wrong, in 2017 we inaugurated, myself and Stoltenberg together, the Center of Excellence to counter hybrid threats in Helsinki. That is a joint EU-NATO project, and that is working, I think, in a remarkable manner, exactly to handle this kind of responses in a joint manner. So I would say what the European Union is doing in cooperation and coordination with NATO and vice versa, and I think this is already a very good starting point.
Thank you, Rector. I think this will be an easy one. How is the European Union coordinating with NATO and with Arctic nations that are part of the that are not part of the European Union on issues related to the Arctic region?
It's the question is interesting. It's easy to a certain extent. Unfortunately, the situation is not easy. So I can easily answer, but unfortunately the picture doesn't look particularly rosy. Why? Because, well, on one side, the good news is that NATO and the European Union coordinate a lot on the Arctic, also because we have many member states allies together. So it's and Finland and Sweden, not being NATO allies, are constantly invited to NATO activities and summits, and there's a Nordic dimension of NATO that is working well beyond the NATO membership, and that is facilitating the NATO-EU coordination on the Nordic dimension. Let's put it this way. But and if I can share with you a personal anecdote, one of my most exciting experiences, I would say, of my entire life has been when I have actually visited the Arctic and Station North and the military bases in Nuuk in the north of Greenland with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. An amazing experience where I really realized how strategically relevant the Arctic is for so many reasons. We don't often realize. That stayed as a cornerstone of my formation, and made me realize that sometimes you have to get to places to see and understand things that you wouldn't understand only reading papers. But even if papers help, obviously. But coming to the bleak point, the European Union has many member states that are part of the Arctic Council, but is not a member itself, not even an observer, I think. I don't remember if it's an observer, an informal observer. There was a long discussion about that, and always ending up in Russia obstructing that accession. And I have to say, if I remember correctly, also with a very, I would say, very timid, very weak US support to that also. Let's say that dimension of the Arctic cooperation is something on which the European Union is trying to play more of a role, but is facing the sort of veto power from the Russian Federation to access that circle of cooperation and decisions. But on the other side, we have Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway is not a member state, but it's so close and so European that we feel the same, through which we can still coordinate actions there. So I would say overall there's an institutional shortcoming, but there's in practice I think a good coordination.
Rector, this question comes from Steve Schenkel of the Naval War College, and we're moving from the Arctic back to the China issue. With China being a systemic...
Well, China has something to do with the Arctic. It's not that far.
That's
indeed.
True.
And one of the things that worries me the most is the fact, well, worries, that I think we should work on more, is the fact that with the melting of the Arctic ice, the routes will change completely. And this will have an impact on all the geopolitical dynamics we are knowing now, and will change completely the map of the world. But again, and China has a lot to do with that.
And if I'm not mistaken, China is making an effort to either join the Arctic Council in some capacity or
exactly.
Enlarge the council. But this question comes from Steve Schenkel from the Naval War College. With China being a systemic rival as termed by the European Union, especially in economic areas, what are your thoughts on the 17+1 China inroads into operating ports and bilateral agreements with European Union countries? Does this undermine European Union solidarity in your opinion?
The format of the 17+1 is a very controversial one, and we've been discussing that at length and over the years with the countries that are participating there, which are not only European Union countries. The 17, the one is China, obviously, but the 17 are a mix of member states of the European Union and Balkan countries that are not members yet, I hope, of the European Union, and hopefully one day and soon members also. It's a difficult element to approach, because these 17 countries, whenever you tell them, and the European institutions tell them, and the other member states tell them, this is not appropriate, or this is not in line with the European Union approaches of coordinating policies towards China, tend to tell you, well, but you have bilateral agreements between your own countries and China. The only difference is that we are grouping ourselves because we are smaller than you, but you have agreements between, I don't know, Italy or Germany or France directly with China bilaterally. Why shouldn't we? Now, the approach that I think the European Union institutions have taken to that respect is that of, first of all, passing messages to China that this is not appreciated, and they do care to a certain extent, because if there's one thing that Chinese recognize very easily is power, especially economic power, and they perfectly realize that the 17 are less than the 27 in economic terms, and also in trade terms, and in general terms, in geopolitical impact terms. So whenever the 27 signal to China that this is not an exercise they feel comfortable with, they factor that in, and I think they at least know that there is an element of complexity there to be handled. Then there's, I think, a normative element that the European Union is trying to make sure is complied with. And that is saying, okay, you can have agreements with China, but make sure that none of the elements of these agreements is contradicting any of the European Union standards, norms, and rules and legislation. And this actually is, it's not saying you cannot do it, but is in practical terms introducing so many obstacles and elements that are completely outside of the Chinese thinking that is indeed creating some real impediments to projects, especially in terms of technical standards. If you think of all the infrastructures, again, it's not my direct competence, but if you think of all the infrastructures, from railways to harbors, the European Union, among its many good or bad things, has a myriad of normative rules, extremely detailed, some would say even too detailed, which are completely out of the mentality, of the mindset of the Chinese project. And so saying, okay, you can have whatever project you want, but it has to respond to this list of criteria, and we're going to check. And it's technical. It's not, it's not a political decision. It's technical. You have to abide by the EU standards, rules, norms, and regulations, and legislation. This creates a boundary, I would say, that is in itself an element of deterrence. And we do the same. The European Union does the same, to my knowledge, unless this was changed recently, with also countries that are not members of the European Union. Because with the Western Balkan countries that are part of the 17, as they are all partners of the European Union or accession countries, so already negotiating access to the European Union, we ask them to respect the same kind of standards, norms, and legislative framework for every project, including infrastructural projects that are carried out on their territory, because the economic support package that the European Union gives to these countries is such that we have to condition it to respect of the rules that we have internally. And so we are extending somehow the normative power of the Union in this field also to countries that are not members of the Union yet.
Thank you, Rector. We've reached 1300 here in Washington, D.C., but I wonder, are you willing to answer one more question?
Let's go.
Thank you, ma'am. This question it touches on something we haven't discussed before. The United States and the European Union are not doing anything to the despotic regimes in developing countries. Many democracy-loving people in these countries are frustrated by the lack of any efforts by the United States and the EU to take any stand on these regimes. Do you agree with this view?
I cannot speak for the United States, but even if I'm quite confident that the Biden administration is taking a different approach to this issue than the previous administration. Let me remind you that at a certain moment, the Secretary of State, I think it was Tillerson, stated in the press room in the State Department that the US policy was not based on human rights principles anymore. And that came as a very cold shower for Europeans. I'm sure that Blinken wouldn't say the same, and for sure Biden wouldn't say the same. But in Europe, we have a very, I can say for Europe for sure this is not the case. We don't always manage to achieve results, but this is a different story. We always try, and we always put pressure and a lot of efforts in trying to address human rights violations, prevent them, support human rights activists with all the instruments of our foreign policy, and even with our security and defense policy. That is a human rights based one. Most of the military presence of the European Union, military but also civilian, always contains a component of human rights training. For instance, we have many training missions in African countries to support the training of the militaries or the security forces, even civilian security forces, police, judiciary. We always have a very consistent part of human rights related trainings and practice, which, as you can imagine, for many of our African interlocutors sounds a bit surreal, but still we do it with very convinced principles. But also with what I was saying before, the European Union has human rights related clauses to all its trade agreements. And I have myself during the 5 years of my mandate, suspended some of the trade agreements or elements of some of the trade agreements or some of the preferential treatments agreements because of violation of human rights, with very tough discussions with the leaderships of those countries involved in Asia, in Africa, probably also in Latin America. So this is something, and on top of that, the European Union has, as an agreement that is now being renovated with the ACP countries, Africa, Pacific, and Caribbean, that has a clause that foresees that in case of violation of human rights, serious violation and breach of human rights, the European Union suspends all the development cooperation aid to that country. And we have done that in a couple of, more than a couple of occasions, even during my mandate. So definitely in the European Union context, this is something we're definitely doing. Then you might have some member states that are not particularly happy with that because of economic interests or trade interests. But this is I would say a cornerstone of the European Union approach to foreign policy, to trade policy, and to security and defense policy as well.
Thank you so much, Rector Mogherini. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up for today. Before we adjourn, please join me in thanking Rector Mogherini for taking the time to help educate us all today. Rector, it's been a pleasure, and I hope that someday in the not too distant future, we'll be able to see you in person.
Looking forward.
Thanks again to all my colleagues at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, Todd Veazey, Nicole Peterson, Mariah Yeager. This is Michael McClausic on behalf of the Institute for National Strategic Studies, thanking you all for joining us. Please stay well, stay strong, and stay in touch.